Who is this guy that he can look the American people in the eye and say, there is no force strong enough on this planet to prevent your teachers to teaching to our tests? And you say your teachers are free? And shame on your superintendents, and shame on your school board officials, and shame on your politicians who will look you in the eye and repeat all these lies. Thank you all so much for being here on a Friday night. I know that's a tremendous sacrifice. If it makes you feel any better, I left Wisconsin this morning. It was 12 degrees, and we had 3 feet of snow on the ground. So there's so many things to do in California. Thank you for spending Friday here. Wednesday. Sorry. It's Friday in Wisconsin. We'll just pretend it. So I'm glad that you're here tonight. And I also want to just take a quick moment and thank Pastor Cliff for letting us, free of charge, be able to have this talk here today. It's a wonderful service to the community. We appreciate it very much. Real quick while I'm here, can I ask, do we have any teachers here or school board members? We do have some teachers here, fantastic. Do we have anybody running for office here today? And we do, okay, so we have some people here, great. I always like to preface my talks by saying a few things. Helen's right, I've given about 450 of these talks now in 43 states. I have testified before 19 different state legislatures about Common Core. This talk is a little broader than that, but I want to assure you at the outset that Common Core and what's happening in our schools is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It is much, much bigger than this. All right? I like to phrase what's going on in the schools as a Washington, D.C. versus the rest of us problem. It doesn't matter what political party we send up there. The fact remains is that each party moves this agenda forward. And what's really at stake here is who controls public schools. The reality is that the public school system should be public, meaning it belongs to the moms and dads. The primary stakeholders of education are the families and the kids who go to these schools. And over the last 40 years, that we have gotten as far away from that model as possible. Centralized, regulated, overregulated, federalized, needlessly expensive, ideological. Now you're bringing in all sorts of data gathering and bean counting for all sorts of organizations that have nothing to do with the welfare of your kids. And so what I'd like to do today is I'll give you an explanation of what Common Core is, but I'm going to do it in a broader context. Now that we're 6 years into the Common Core era, and you have to remember, no state in this union was consulted about Common Core. No state contributed to the writing of the standards. That these standards were put in place before anybody in your state had a chance to see them. These standards have never been tested anywhere in the world. The idea that they've been benchmarked, you keep hearing from the people who support Common Core that it's better than what you have. I will prove to you definitively that that can't be so because the people who created it will tell you it wasn't tested. It's never been done anywhere. So we're going to take a long look at Common Core. I would like to step back, though, and point out that, unfortunately, I suppose, in my life, the one thing that I've seen more parents upset about than anything in my 45 years on this planet is Common Core. So, I mean, it's a good thing. Common Core has awakened more parents. It's caused more controversy. It's got more families involved in education than at any time in my life. Not even sex ed curriculum in the 70s was as controversial as what's going on now. So that's the good thing. People are turning out. But the one problem we have is that people often think that Common Core is exclusively the problem. That if we were to get rid of Common Core, the schools would be just fine. And I would like to step back a little bit to demonstrate to you how we got here. Because Common Core is a problem but it is a symptom too. For 40 years now, and really the real problems began in the late 1970s when we created the Federal Department of Education. We had managed to educate American kids for 100 years and give them arguably the best education in the world. The American educational system was the envy of the world through the 1960s. It wasn't until we created the Federal Department of Education, you can chart it on a graph. Our kids' performance really in all areas of education have gone down since we created this monolithic federal department. And if we understand anything about oversized government, generally speaking, when you get these big federal bureaucracies, they're expensive, everything goes up, way too much control, and usually the quality of what they do diminishes, and that's exactly true here. I'd like to go back as we begin the talk to this fella. This is John Gruber. He is one of the prime architects of the new healthcare legislation, so-called Obamacare. And again, over the course of this talk, we will be talking about Democrats, Republicans. The blame is unilateral across the board. But what Mr. Gruber, after the Obamacare legislation was put in, you remember Nancy Pelosi's famous statement that you have to pass this law to find out what's in it. Only after the law was on the books did Mr. Gruber, who was one of the architects of Obamacare, come out in November of last year and say this.
You had a law which said healthy people are going to pay in. It made explicit that healthy people pay in and sick people get money. It would not have passed. Okay, just like the lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to get anything to pass.
Call it lack of transparency was the only way we got that health care law in. If we had told the voters what was in it, if we allowed you to vote on whether or not you wanted it, it never would have passed. Lack of transparency is key to getting all this stuff done. And what Ms. Pelosi said is exactly right. Nobody read that bill. 26,000 pages, nobody read that bill before it was passed. And yet, Common Core, the health care law was a model of transparency compared to how Common Core was put in your schools. At least C-SPAN held hearings on Obamacare before it became law. You had the Supreme Court weigh in on it. You had both sessions of Congress, the Senate and the House, talked about and debated Obamacare. None of that was done with Common Core. I would argue that what's going on in your schools is every bit more transforming than what's going on with healthcare. And yet no one ever had a vote on it. Nobody ever heard about it. Common Core was in 46 states before anybody knew what the words were. And here we are 6 years into Common Core. And can I just ask by a simple show of hands, 6 years into the Common Core era, how many of you would still say you have no real idea what it is? And if you look around, we're talking 60% of the audience. 6 years into Common Core and nobody knows. I'm going to stop calling public schools public. Because if they were public, they'd belong to you. They'd have to ask your permission. They'd get your objective, your vote on this. They didn't. I'm going to start calling them government schools, because that's what they are. Again, what Mr. Gruber, in a moment of honesty, said about how big bureaucracies get this stuff put in, by not telling you, by hiding it from you, by telling you, we'll let you know what's in it after you read it. That's exactly what happened here with your educational system. And I would argue, even if you think you like Common Core, can we, as free people, countenance the way it was put in? Are we still free people if things like this that impact all of our public 60 million American school kids, if the provenance for this has nothing to do with us? Are we really a free people anymore? Go all the way back to World War II and prior to World War II. Everybody knows you could go to every state in this union, almost any big city in the country, and you will find monuments and memorials to the two founders of American public education. The two names you hear again and again are Horace Mann and John Dewey. Every community almost has a Horace Mann school. And we must understand that the founding fathers made no provision for public education, none. Because they understood that if you put the federal government in charge of education, inevitably the federal government would educate for its dictates, its needs and necessities, not the needs of the people. So it wasn't until quite long after the founding documents that Horace Mann, in the late 19th century, conceived of American public school. Do you know the model he used for American public schools, Horace Mann, the father of our schools? the Prussian militaristic dictatorial model. American public schools were based off the 19th century totalitarian Prussian regime, the regime that gave rise to Hitler. And what was the purpose of education in totalitarian Prussia in the 19th century? It was not to provide reading, writing, and arithmetic to kids. It was to school them in obedience to the state. That was the model. As a matter of fact, here's what Horace Mann said in 1858 about American public schools. After a child has arrived at the legal age for attending school, whether child of noble or of peasant, the only two absolute grounds of exemption from attendance are sickness and death. We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. Right from the get-go, American public schools, the argument here is this one. And then, of course, John Dewey, the philosopher and card-carrying communist, I might add, John Dewey was. I mean, not a pretend communist. He actually had a card for the party. Outside of Horace Mann, he is the single most influential figure in American public schools. And in the mid-1930s, here's what John Dewey said the purpose of your public schools were for. The children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the collective society which is coming, where everyone would be interdependent. Do you understand what the common in Common Core means 80 years later? The common in Common Core means every kid gets the same education now. And that may sound liberating, but not if the education overall is lower. What do you have to sacrifice? You got 60 million American school kids. Let's do just a simple basic math problem here. You're going to get 60 million kids to exactly the same place in every subject. By definition, is that going to be a lower or a higher standard? It has to be. That's what they're talking about. The purpose of education is not to allow your kids become what they can be. It's not to awaken in them a love of learning, to turn gifted young math students into mathematicians or kids who can write well into writers. That was never the intention of this. The common in Common Core means that. We are sacrificing children's individuality. Not every kid is good at math. Not every kid is good at history. Not every kid writes well. So what? Let those kids use school to become what they're good at, right? Everybody gets a basic education. I was horrible at math in school, right? But when I was in third grade, I could write at a high school level. That's what I do now, right? The world needs more than CPAs. And the reality is that the premise of this from Dewey, from Horace Mann, is that the purpose of schools is, well, let's go a little further. I'll show you. How about the National Education Association? The largest teachers union in the country today, and the most politically active union. The teachers union, the NEA, spends more of its teachers' dues on lobbying than any other union in the country. And here's what the NEA said in 1948. Quote, "Far too many people in America, both in and out of education, look upon the elementary school as a place to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. You fools, you actually believe that." And then 6 months later in 1948, education for international understanding involves the use of education as a force for conditioning the will of the people. What are we doing in our schools, right? You see, there's a school, Eric was telling me about this. There's a school, great school in the area here. Walked in it the other day, and right on the big plaque on the front of the wall, a public high school, right? The purpose of the school basically is what? To promote international understanding, right? Common, collective, communal, interdependent. What are we driving for here? And they're telling you flat out that, and most American parents still believe this, that you go to school to learn things. You go to school to master subject areas. That is not the design, right? How about this? By 1969, the NEA said this: schools will become clinics whose purpose is to provide individual psychosocial treatment for the student. And teachers must become psychosocial therapists. That was 1969. Do you know how much of Common Core now is devoted to psychosocial education? Do you know how much monitoring your teachers have to do of behavioral patterns in classrooms, of psychological development in classrooms? Your teachers are spending more time addressing conduct and behavioral issues in the classroom than they are teaching now. And let me ask you this question. What qualifies somebody with a 4-year degree in education to clinically understand your kids? Nothing. Common Core has pulled the responsibilities of teaching away from teachers. In this very same high school here in the area, they call the teachers facilitators. Arnie Duncan, your former Secretary of Education, stepped down about a year ago, 6 months ago. Arnie Duncan called for this. We have to start renaming teachers facilitators. It is not the job of teachers to teach anymore. A teacher has wisdom or skills or talent to hand directly to a kid. A facilitator is somebody who takes something that's handed to them and hands it off. That's what's happening with the centralizing of curriculum, the centralizing of the standards. Everything is being pre-chewed. Teachers are handed or uploaded to their computers. In Wisconsin, my state, teachers receive 6 days before they teach a lesson. Our teachers in Wisconsin are receiving faxes from the state entity telling them what they will teach that day. This is the regularization of this, right? Psychosocial therapists. How about this? NEA spoke, this was in 2011 at the United Nations. We talk about the collectivism. We talk about the internationalizing of this. Programs like the International Baccalaureate. Common Core, which is now being moved from America to schools all across the world, primarily right now, Middle Eastern schools. We can talk about that later. In 2011, people don't realize that Bill Gates, who spent over $6 billion on Common Core of his own money, Bill Gates in 2004 signed a mutual agreement contract with the United Nations. He, a private citizen, was going to work with the UN to create this one world form of education. Here is NEA spokesperson Diane Schneider talking to the United Nations in 2011. People ask all the time, why is there such shockingly high levels of sexuality education, of normalizing all different kinds of sexuality? Well, listen to Diane Schneider in 2011. She says, and I quote, "Oral sex, masturbation, and orgasms need to be taught in education. The only way to combat heterosexism and gender conformity is comprehensive sex education. Gender identity expression and sexual orientation are a spectrum, and those opposed to homosexuality are stuck in a binary box that family and religion create." Who are the enemies? If this is the purpose of American public education, who are the enemies? The enemies are the family, and the enemies are the religion. This is nothing more than an erosion of Judeo-Christian values. It is nothing more than a taking down of family. Who should be responsible for teaching children sexuality issues? Who should be responsible for passing on morality and family values, religious values? This is what we're at war with here, right? And this is why they're doing it. Comprehensive sexuality. Michigan is currently considering a law that will ban the teaching of, even mentioning the word abstinence to kids in schools. This is what they mean by comprehensive sexual reform. Why are they, and people all across the country have noticed this, why is there so much sexualization in even little kids' books? Why is there so much emphasis on, for little kids who are too young to understand what homo or heterosexuality is? Children as young as 6 or 7 who have not developed the ability to think abstract yet are now being fed these things. Why? Because you need comprehensive sexuality reform. Comprehensive sexuality reform is the progressive answer to what used to be abstinence-based education. Right? And so 2011, right when Common Core was being put in your schools. Right? How about this? I mentioned that Common Core is so controversial, not necessarily because the idea of a standard is controversial. I would posit to you that the people who promote Common Core are trying to tell you that we now have a standard. And everybody likes standards. That's nonsense. There have always been standards in classrooms. When you have a teacher teaching to children, testing and evaluating them, you have a standard. It's cliche now to say it, but America became a superpower on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. The control, you had one teacher teaching 40 kids at all different grade levels, and they got fantastic educations. You had a standard. The teacher who knew the kids in front of her, she could evaluate them. And then what happened? We moved away from that. In the 1970s, control of the classroom went from the teachers to the school districts. In the 80s, it went from the school districts to the states. In the early 2000s, with No Child Left Behind, it went from the states to the federal government. You are getting farther and farther away from that. This is the truth. The only real method of teaching that works, you gotta have three things to teach a kid. You gotta have a disciplined child. You gotta have a committed parent. And you gotta have an effective teacher. If you've got those three things, education works every time. But the teachers are increasingly handcuffed now. The states, the local districts now have had their authority and their ability to impact choice in the classroom taken from them. The states themselves now have bartered away their freedom to set curriculum. It's all being done nationally now. Think about this. You are as far removed from teacher, parent, and student as you could possibly get in this country unless the United Nations was to take over education, which would remove it one step. Right? So, in discussing with you the bipartisanship of Common Core, the universal hatred for it, I am going to start with the Washington State Democrat Party. State of Washington, which your northern neighbor, in some ways every bit as progressive a state as California is, about a year ago, January of 2015, they became the first state political party to call for an immediate ban on Common Core. These were progressive Democrats. If I could spend hours explaining to you why Common Core is bad from a Christian perspective or from a conservative perspective, but then the temptation is to say, you right-wing lunatics. So if we take a look at why Common Core is bad by the progressive Democrat, and by the way, in Washington State, if you want to run for office in Washington State as a Democrat, you will get no money from the party unless you adopt this platform, statewide Democrat Party. Let this bill explain to you why Common Core is bad. Here's the article. The Central Committee of the Washington State Democrat Party has passed a resolution that roundly condemns the Common Core standards. This is the very first time a statewide Democrat Party committee has taken a public position against Common Core, and it happened in the very backyard of Bill Gates, his state. And can I just stop with that for a second? Why is it when Bill Gates spends $6 billion to buy public schools, nobody's outraged? Has anybody ever asked Bill Gates, what are your credentials? What are Bill Gates? He's a wonderful Microsoft guy, but what are his educational credentials? He's never taken a course in education. He's never had a class in education. He's never taught a class. He has no background. I promise you this. If it were the evil Koch brothers who bought public education for $6 billion, you would hear about it every day. What qualifies Bill Gates? So the people in Washington, the Democrats who deal with Microsoft on a daily basis, they recognize the problem here. It happened in the backyard of the Gates Foundation, which has provided the funding that made the National Standards Project possible. Here is the actual resolution. Whereas the copyrighted and therefore unchangeable Common Core state standards stop there. You've been told, well, we can teach the standard any way we want. You've been told they're just a wonderful benchmark, and California teachers can choose any books they want. No, you can't. The whole thing is copyrighted. You have no flexibility. And by the way, the only way we have to measure Common Core are these huge national tests. You understand, right, that whoever controls the tests controls what your kids learn. Your teachers are being evaluated primarily now on how those kids do on the tests. We have states in the union, 13 states in the union, have gotten to the point now where teachers are offering no other tests in the classroom They're not giving their own tests or quizzes because their kids are spending so much time studying, up to 6, 8, 12 weeks a year in school, simply preparing for the national tests. So teachers aren't evaluating kids on what they do day to day. They're simply preparing kids to take these big national tests. The copyrighted and therefore unchangeable Common Core standards are a set of controversial, top-down. They came from the federal government. They didn't come from the states. They are a top-down K-12 academic standards that were promulgated by wealthy private interest groups, think Bill Gates, and that were created without any research-based evidence of their validity. They have never been tested. They have never been tried. They have never been used anywhere in the world. They don't know if they're going to work. Your kids are guinea pigs. You keep being told that they're better. How do you know that? I'll let Bill Gates tell you in about 5 minutes that these things are untested. They are without wealthy private interest groups without any research-based evidence of validity, and these standards are developmentally inappropriate in the youngest grades. Why are they teaching? What I just said to you is exactly right. By exposing 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds to complicated questions of human sexuality, you are asking children to think abstractly whose brains haven't evolved yet. It's the same problem with Common Core math. Common Core math has many problems, but one of them is that you are introducing abstract math concepts to kids too young to grasp them. The brain has not evolved that way yet. Okay? And so, beyond that, developmentally inappropriate. Whereas, as a means of avoiding the U.S. Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibition against federal meddling in state education policy, and this is the other thing, Common Core is illegal. Besides the 10th Amendment, which prohibits the feds from meddling, tampering with state educational decisions, 3 different statutes, federal statutes, from 1965 legally prohibit the federal government from creating national standards or national curriculum. They couldn't do it. So what did the federal government do? They farmed it out to 2 lobbyist groups. They contracted with 2 non-governmental lobbyist groups to write the standards, not the states, 2 lobbyist groups, right? As a means of avoiding the 10th Amendment prohibition, 2 unaccountable private trade associations, the National Governors Association and the CCSSO, they received millions of dollars of funding from the Gates people to create the standards. And whereas the U.S. Department of Education improperly pressured state legislatures into adopting the standards and the high-stakes tests that went with them as a condition of competing for federal race-to-the-top dollars. The feds couldn't legally write standards or curriculum, but they wanted control of education. Think about what happened with health care. The federal government wanted to control health care. They want to control education, too. And so what they did is they could not, unlike health care, where there was no law saying necessarily they couldn't control health care, with education they couldn't. So they contracted with these 2 lobbyist groups. This is the Democrat Party of Washington telling you this. Contracted with 2 lobbyist groups, but then how did they get them into your state? Well, they bribed you, California, $900 million. When your state took Common Core without ever seeing the standards, because the federal government gave you $900 million for your education department 1 year. So for $900 million, you applied for a federal Race to the Top grant. Your state got Race to the Top monies totaling in excess of $900 million. And simply by taking that federal handout, you were obligated to take the Common Core standards before you even saw what they were. That's how it happened. This is illegal, of course, right, as the state of Washington is telling you. Whereas the U.S. Department of Education improperly pressured state legislatures into adopting the standards and tests as a condition of competing for federal race-to-the-top dollars, stimulus funds that should have been based on need. I hope that makes you mad. Do you remember in 2008 when Bush was going out and Obama was coming in? They're both to blame for this. Do you remember that? And you were told, unless we ponied up billions and billions of dollars to bail out banks and car companies, did you know that billions of dollars of that stimulus money went to the Department of Education to create Common Core? Did you know that? They didn't tell you that, did they? No. But that's what happened, right, as Washington's telling you. Money that should have been based on need, not coercion. How about this? Whereas the implementation of Common Core will cost local school districts hundreds of millions of dollars to pay, because the feds aren't, for standardized computer-based tests, new technology, new curricula, teacher training, at a time when Washington is already insufficiently funding K-12 basic education. All of this without any proven benefits to students. And whereas some states have already withdrawn from Common Core. Therefore, be it resolved that we call upon the Washington State Legislature and the Superintendent of Public Instruction to withdraw from Common Core and keep K-12 education student-centered and accountable to the people of Washington State. What a wonderful thing that your kids should be, that the education of California kids should be student-centered, and it should be accountable to the people of California. That's not true anymore, California. You do not have that control. You cannot change these things. And $900 million, I hate to break this to you, the money you took for Common Core, that's about 6% of 1 year's state education budget. So you sold your soul for 6% of 1 year's budget. That's all it took, right, to give up this control. These are the problems with Common Core. This is Arne Duncan. He became the Department of Education Secretary, the chief education. When Barack Obama took office, this is the man he put in charge. He has no formal educational background. He's a sociologist by trade. He's never taught a class. Why would you put a sociologist as the head of the Department of Ed? Because you're going to make the Department of Education a sociological agency, not an educational one, right? Listen to what Arne Duncan said when this was just getting started back in 2009.
I think our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day. So it's not just lengthening.
So 8 to 8 or something like that?
At home, we attached healthcare clinics to about 24 of our schools. Where schools truly become the centers of the community, great things happen. And this is a chance to really create what I think the 21st century school has to look like. This needs to be the norm, not the exception. Time matters tremendously, and all of our families need our doors open longer.
Is this a big ticket item in terms of financial resources?
Finances is a piece of this, and we again have significant financial resources, unprecedented financial resources coming to the table. But let me be clear, this is thinking differently and being creative.
Thinking differently and being creative. Did you hear his little faux pas? Our families need our stores open, right? Remember what the UN said, the lady at the UN, remember what the John Dewey said? Our schools have to become clinics. We're building now, as he pointed out to you, this is 2009, we are starting to build clinics attached to our schools. Your daughter shows up, your 13-year-old daughter shows up to school with a couple Midol, she can be suspended. But the federal government is now building clinics onto schools so they can begin to administer medicine and primarily, let's be real here, primarily advanced forms of birth control to your sons and daughters without consulting you anymore. In conjunction with the national health care law. See, this is the thing people don't realize either. Common Core is a piece of this. If you read the 26,000 pages of the health care law, you will find hundreds of places where the federal government, in the name of national health care, empowers schools to gather data on your kids, health care data, and I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but under the national health care law, under Obamacare, the schools have the capacity now to even take your 13, 14, or 15-year-old daughters off campus and take them to an abortion clinic and to get that service provided and paid for them without consulting the parents now. This is what they mean by comprehensive, right? This is why do you think they're building clinics onto middle school, elementary, high schools, right? Okay. And then, all right, sorry. One more from Arne Duncan. 12, 13 hours a day he wants them open, right? Now listen to this.
The one idea I threw out that I wanted to sort of road test it with the kids too, I thought, is the idea of public boarding schools. And that's a little bit of a different idea or a controversial idea. But the question is, do we have some children where there's not a mom, there's not a dad, there's not a grandma, there's just nobody home? And there are certain kids we should have 24/7.
So we want the schools, the public schools, open 12, 13, 14 hours a day, 365 days a year. We want them to be, you see what's happening with these public schools they want? They want them to replace the families. Already in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where I just came from, Green Bay, Wisconsin won a grant. Green Bay, Wisconsin already provides breakfast, lunch, and dinner for their elementary and middle and high school kids. And because Green Bay, Wisconsin says it's not fair, it's a stigma if you're only providing free food for the poor kids. That makes the poor kids feel bad. So we legally now in Wisconsin have to provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner for all the kids. And Green Bay, like Memphis, Tennessee, that a couple years ago, they won grants to be able to offer breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the public schools all summer long when school's out. Because you can't feed the kids for 9 months and then not, right? And so for 12 months of a year, the public schools are feeding these kids. What's happening here is exactly what you saw up there. The schools will become surrogate parents. They're going to replace you. That's the objective here. What he says here is pretty shocking too. Is this even true? Do we really have an epidemic in this country of 8-year-olds living in houses by themselves? Where there are nobody, there's no grandma, there's no grandpa, there's no mom, there's no dad, there are no big sisters, nobody. First of all, we don't have that problem in this country. And even if we did, don't you have city organizations, county organizations, state organizations that can intervene for the welfare of that child? Public boarding schools, are you kidding me? Where we decide, the federal government, which of your children belong to us 24/7? Is that a power you want? And you think about the Department of Education. You have no vote in it. You have no way to get rid of this guy. He's appointed by the president, right? You have no representative way to get at these guys. This is a complete enroading of your constitutional rights and your family rights by bureaucrats who are unaccountable to us, the taxpayers. Even if you think you like Common Core, how do you justify the way it was done? It gets better. This is Bill Gates. I'm going to prove to you right now, and the man who paid for this, he's going to tell you, in 2012, he said, we're not going to know if Common Core is going to work for another 10 years, right?
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
So we're not going to know until 2022 if any of this is going to work. And how many times have you been told that Common Core is a higher standard? How many times have you been told that Common Core is better than what your schools already have? How many times have you been told that Common Core has been tested and measured? How can it be when the guy who paid for it told you it never was? It's all lies. Well, you remember what John Gruber said, right? Lie to them. The bigger the lie, the more they'll believe it. And how about this little nugget? I happen to think, as a 25-year teacher, I happen to think this is the most dangerous lie of Common Core. It is the lie that says that your teachers are free to teach any way they want. Listen to what Bill Gates, the guy who orchestrated this, said about that.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests, next-generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
Notice the date, 2009, right when as soon as President Obama took office, this began. 2009. And you heard what he said, right? First of all, did you catch that? He admits, initially, $350 million that first year of the stimulus package went to the Department of Education to create Common Core tests. Please explain to me again how this is state-led. When before any state had ever heard of Common Core, in 2009, the standards weren't even written yet, but they're already writing the tests that the standards would follow. Think about that. And you heard what he said. When the tests are finally aligned to the standards, the curriculum will have to follow. By the way, 42 states in the union, including California, took their first national Common Core tests last March. Just last March. They're just lining it up now. You really think your teachers are free to teach what they want? He just told you they can't be. It gets better, though, right? This is David Coleman. This should outrage. You think you're mad yet? This is David Coleman. He is the chief architect of Common Core. He is the man most responsible for the standards. Go to his own website, his own Wikipedia page. He is the architect of Common Core. And by the way, how can he, one man, be the architect of Common Core when you've been told it's state-led? In fact, don't you love what they named Common Core? The Common Core state standards. Well, it says in the title, Pesta, that they're state-led. It must be so, right? And Obamacare, the real name for Obamacare is the Affordable Care Act. Does anybody believe that either? This is the argument here. This is David Coleman. He has zero. He has even less educational background than Arnie Duncan. He has never taken an education class, never been trained in education. He has no teaching experience. He knows nothing about schooling or education. He's the guy in charge. In fact, let me show you. In 2011, David Coleman was introduced to a group of teachers who were going to have to follow his direction. This will blow your mind.
He has been involved in virtually every step of setting the national standards, and he doesn't have a single credential for it. He's never taught in an elementary school, I think. I actually don't know. He's never edited a scholarly journal, but I think he has written scholarly papers, and a variety of other things that everybody here has done some of. He hasn't done.
You'd think someone with Lauren's experience would understand you never tell the truth when you're introducing someone.
Hang on, I'm going to go back. That's funny, isn't it? It's funny that when you introduce somebody, you never tell the truth. Right? This is a man who has been involved at every stage of setting the national standards, and he does not have a single credential. So this clearly can't be about education, right? I'm going to play that again because I want you to pick up where I left off and listen to what comes next.
He has been involved in virtually every step of setting the national standards, and he doesn't have a single credential for it. He's never taught in an elementary school, I think. I actually don't know. He's never edited a scholarly journal, but I think he has written scholarly papers, and a variety of other things that everybody here has done some of. He hasn't done.
You'd think someone with Lauren's experience would understand you never tell the truth when you're introducing someone.
I actually think it's really important to try to base what I'm about to say to you on evidence I share with you rather than on the sands of my qualifications. So if I ask you or talk to you about doing something, it should be evident that it makes sense to you to do, because I have no other authority.
Because I have no other authority. And again, please explain to me the state-led thing again. When he's telling the teachers, when I tell you how to implement this. This is you know what they would call this? This is a banana republic. This is a complete end run of accountability, of democracy, of constitutional regulation. I mean, this is all being done by powerful people you've never heard of. At least Arnie Duncan had to be appointed Secretary of Education. This guy has no credentials, no background, yet he is the man most responsible for your kids' Common Core. And nobody's ever heard of him. And if you decide you don't like him, what are you going to do about it? You want to get your mind blown a little bit more? No sooner did he oversee the writing of the standards than he left the Common Core Committee. And do you know where he is now? He is the president of the college boards. He is the man. He's now rewriting the SATs, the exams your kids are going to have to take to get into college to conform to his Common Core standards. Think about that. The man, the unaccountable, unelected, unqualified by his own admission guy who did this is now in charge of the SATs and the ACTs, is now making sure that your kids will have to pass Common Core tests if they want to go to college. How's that for taking over the whole system? That's where he is right now. Oh, and by the way, he's also in charge at the college boards of all the advanced placement courses your kids take in high school to get college credit. And he is rewriting all of those to conform to Common Core. And this is it. If I'm right that the biggest, most dangerous lie of Common Core is that teachers are free, listen to him.
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
Who is this guy that he can look the American people in the eye and say, there is no force strong enough on this planet to prevent your teachers to teaching to our tests? And you say your teachers are free? And shame on your superintendents, and shame on your school board officials, and shame on your politicians who will look you in the eye and repeat all these lies. They have to know better. This is Jason Zimba. He is the man most responsible for Common Core math. It's his baby. If David Coleman is the architect of the standards in general, he is routinely referred to, Jason Zimba, as the architect of Common Core math. In this video, he admits that Common Core math is not meant to prepare your kids for college math. It is not rigorous. It is designed, maybe the best math kids might be able to start a 2-year tech college program, right? And yet you've been told, right, that Common Core math is so incomprehensible because it's so much harder. It's just obtuse. It's just developmentally inappropriate, as the Washington State Democrat said. Listen to this short exchange. By the way, the woman interviewing him is Dr. Sandy Stotsky, who's been to your state many times, and she will be here again in April. Dr. Stotsky is considered the foremost English language specialist in the country, how you teach kids to read. She was hired by the Common Core people to validate the curriculum. She took one look at it and said, no, I won't do it. They hired her, she took a look at it and said, no. Now she's traveling the country warning you about this, and she'll be here next month. Here she is, getting Jason Zimba to admit that this math is weak.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
I think it's a fair critique, Dr. Stotsky, that this is a minimal definition of college readiness.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM. It's also not for selective colleges.
It's not only not for STEM. STEM, those unimportant subjects like science, technology, engineering, and math. This wasn't made for that. What is the purpose of a math curriculum if it's not to make your kids ready for careers in science, technology, engineering, and math? Not only is it not for STEM, it's not for selective colleges. He's being a little disingenuous here. He's going to use the lofty example of UC Berkeley. But you know what that means, right? Selective college? A selective college is any college that has a basic math entrance requirement, which is to say all of them. I won't stop it this time. I'll let it play to the end. But listen to that one more time.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM. It's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley, right?
But we have to think of our engineering colleges
and that's
scientific.
That's true. I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that. But your issue is really broader than that.
Oh yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that out.
I'm not just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
That's right. It's both, I think, in the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
What he said there is critical, but not to call something college ready that only applies to a lower level of math that will not prepare your kids for international competition in any way. And all he can do is shake his head, yes, that's right, it was never intended for this. What did I say at the outset here? What does the common and Common Core mean? Most kids, let's be honest here, most kids can't do math at a high level. I've got 5 college degrees. I can't do math beyond algebra. I'm mentally incapable of it. It's not the way my mind works. So what? Most kids can't do math at a high level. But now you're being told that that's socially unjust. Because not all kids can do math at a high level. We're going to make sure in the name of equity, fairness, and social justice that no kids do math very well. That's what the Common and Common Core means. That we're going to pull everybody down to the same level because it's not fair that God made some kids better in one subject or another, right? That's what this is, Common and Common Core. And look, it's not just me. Your president, before he became president, said exactly the same things we've been saying for 5 years. How do you you're telling me you're going to give one test to 60 million American kids. You really think that that one test for 60 million kids is going to tell a teacher anything meaningful? There's no possible way one test, that broad, that big, can tell any teacher how to fix her classroom. It has no practical value for working teachers. All it does, these big tests, is aggregate data and gather information on your kids that federal bean counters use to process their money requests. There is nothing that these kinds of one-size-fits-all super big tests, this is not my opinion. This is basic psychometrics, right? You can't create one test this broad and expect anybody in a classroom to get anything out of it. Furthermore, your teachers are not allowed to see the tests. They are prohibited from seeing them. So you think about that. Your kids are taking these meaningless tests, and the federal government's telling you what they scored, but the teachers aren't allowed to go back and look at the tests their kids took and figure out what they did wrong. How's that going to improve anything? Of course, I hope you're beginning to see this was not meant to improve anything. It equalizes, it levels off. It's ideology. You want to know what this is? I mean, you call it what it is, social justice. This is Marxism, this is socialism. Right? It's not fair that some kids know more than other kids. We can't make every kid know everything, so we're going to make sure every kid knows only the same things. That's what these tests do. No other function to them. And your president agreed with me the year before he became president. This is what he said about those tests.
Don't tell us that the only way to teach a child is to spend too much of a year preparing him to fill out a few bubbles in a standardized test. We know that's not true.
You think about what the president just said. And he was right. He was right. God bless him, in 2007 he was right. And he was speaking in that clip to the National Education Association at a big rally. He said, don't tell me that the only way to measure our kids' success is to have them fill out a couple of bubbles on a big... That's what we're doing now. It's interesting that no sooner did he become president than that became the way. I've got... Sorry. Here we go.
Don't tell us that the only way to teach a child is to spend too much of a year preparing him to fill out a few bubbles in a standardized test. We know that's not true.
And all the teachers stand up and applaud. And now those same teachers are trapped in a circumstance where that's the only way that they can measure them, right? This is what happened in the space of 1 year. And then, this is going to get you mad too. Who do you think is grading your kids' tests? 60 million tests? There aren't enough teachers in the country to grade them. Do you know that they're literally, companies like Pearson, Smarter Balance, they're taking out advertisements on Craigslist, paying $9 an hour to grade your kids' tests. This is going to make you really mad. You ready?
The company posted this ad to Craigslist. It's to find people to grade the exams.
We looked at an essay every 2 minutes, a short answer every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds. We don't understand your kids. We don't understand anyone's kids.
I was told when I was beginning a project that last year, there were a certain amount of 2s, a certain amount of 3s, a certain amount of 4s. We expect that to be similar this year. If that's not similar, they will tell you, we're scoring too many 3s, we're scoring too many 4s. And they'll say, you have to learn to see more papers as a 3. You have to learn to see more papers as a 4.
Think about what just happened there. None of the people you saw have any educational training or background. The first fella pointed out, we were reading an essay every 5 minutes, a short answer every 5 seconds. How in the world do you evaluate something like that? And none of these people have ever been trained. $9 an hour, you're pulling people off the street, and then the absolute gall, they're telling their paid reviewers, you're not doing it right. Score more 4s. They're rigging the game. They're slanting the numbers. Do you see how meaningless these tests are if they're paying Craigslist people $9 an hour? And then they're telling the Craigslist people, no, do it our way, not yours. And the whole system is predicated on these stupid, meaningless exams that President Obama himself said don't mean anything. This, California, is what your kids now are going to have. This is the sole benchmark by which your kids are going to be evaluated moving forward, these meaningless exams. And nobody with an educational degree is looking at them. Amazing. And now. Okay, so what happened? We now have, I don't know if you've been paying attention, about a month and a half ago, Republicans in the House and the Senate passed the ESSA Act. Anybody heard of the ESSA Act? No, you didn't, of course. A month and a half ago, Republicans in the House and the Senate forced this bill through. What was the ESSA? It's now the law of the land. What is the ESSA? It is a basic revision of No Child Left Behind. 10 years they've been revising failed No Child Left Behind. We spent $60 billion on No Child Left Behind. It was a brainchild of the George Bush administration, although George Bush back in 2002 did not write No Child Left Behind. You know who he turned it over to? You know who wrote that? Teddy Kennedy. So George Bush, we're led to believe that George Bush is this arch right-winger. He allowed the most liberal member of the Senate to completely write the No Child legislation. And typical progressive big government education. Very expensive, very ineffective. Kids, 12 years of No Child Left Behind, a whole lost generation of kids. And what were the major problems of No Child Left Behind? Stupid, meaningless, high-stakes tests. No control of the classroom for teachers, too much federal interventionism, too much ideology being imported into the classroom, and so what did they get rid of No Child Left Behind, and what do they put in? Common Core. And Common Core is all those things on steroids, right? Isn't this the way with the federal government? They take something over, can't make it work. And so do they ever turn it back to the states? I'll walk back to Wisconsin. If you can give me one example of the federal government taking something over, and then when they realized they couldn't, handing it back to the states. They never do it. So what is Common Core? It's more expensive, it's more federal control, it's bigger high-stakes tests. Whenever the feds fail, they just make it more of what was failing. Bigger and harder to deal with, right? So what happened? For 10 years, they've been revising No Child Left Behind. Almost 1,100 pages, this new bill, this ESSA Act. Do you know, and I'm ashamed of him, Paul Ryan from my state, the supposed leader of the House. He gave his caucus 2 days to read 1,100 pages before he forced the vote. So you know what happened in 2 days, right? No one read it. And so what does the ESSA Act do? It enshrines Common Core at the federal level. It retroactively goes back and legalizes the illegal things the federal government did to do this. It ramps up mandatory federal government data gathering on your kids and legalizes it. What was illegal federally is now legal thanks to the Republicans in the House and Senate. This is from December, a couple months ago. Despite warnings from anti-Common Core activists, Republican lawmakers rammed through the new federal education bill, the Every Student Succeeds Act, setting in concrete the destructive education policies of the Obama administration. Why would Republicans, evil Republicans, support the Obama agenda? Maybe it's because we really don't have two political parties in this country anymore. Maybe what we have, and I started the talk with this, what we've got here in this country is a Washington, D.C. versus the rest of us problem. And I don't care who you are, as we've seen with Chief Justice Roberts, right? I don't care who you are. When you get inside the Washington Beltway, it's all about protecting Washington control. And so what happened? We now have proof that Republican leadership, including Senator Lamar Alexander, Representative John Klein, House Speaker Paul Ryan, betrayed their constituents, giving federal government unprecedented legal control over education. Ryan allowed Congress just 2 days to study the ESSA legislation, more than 1,000 pages written over 10 years. And notice the date on this, the same December 21st, 3 months ago. Arne Duncan, who I showed you, the unqualified Department of Education secretary who ushered all this in, when he heard that Republicans passed the ESSA bill, he called it a miracle. He said, we progressives would never have dared ask for all the things the Republicans just gave us. Here's what happened. In a just-released interview with Politico Pro, Arne Duncan expressed stunned surprise about how wonderful the ESSA turned out for progressive educrats. Quote, I'm stunned at how much better it ended up than either the House or the Senate bill going into conference was going to be. I had a Democrat congressman say to me that it's a miracle. He's literally never seen anything like it. If you look at the substance of what is there, embedded now in the law, are the values we've promoted and proposed forever. Everything you just saw in this presentation was made law now, right? Everything Horace Mann wanted, everything John Dewey preached for, everything the NAEA said your schools were going to become. Those clinics, those psychology centers, the hijacking of your education in the name of progressive ideology and sociology, well, that's all now law, right? Everything, the values embedded in the law are the values we've promoted and proposed forever. The core of our agenda from day one. It's all in there. For the first time in our nation's history, this is now the letter of the law. They have the right to gather data on you. They have the right to minister physically to your kids without your permission. They have the right to use education to teach propaganda. They have the right to base your kids' education on tests that have no value. They have the legal right now. Thank your Republicans. It gets better. On the complicity of the Republicans, Arne Duncan said this. We had Lamar Alexander and Joe Klein. We had many, many conversations, he said, behind the scenes. And I said to them, for us to support it, they'd have to get rid of the far right. By the way, when Arne Duncan says far right, he means any mom and dad who thinks they should be in control of their kids' education. I told Lamar Alexander, I told Representative Klein, that if we're going to get this passed, you guys are going to have to turn your backs on the right. Right? I said, for us to support it, the left, they'd have to shed the far right. I honestly didn't know if they'd have the political courage to do that. But they both said they would, and they did, and I give them tremendous credit for that. Here's Arne Duncan's backroom chat with Paul Ryan. About a month before final Senate passage of the bill, I ran into Speaker Ryan, and we just talked briefly. I asked if he was going to back this, whether he's willing to take on the right. I just asked him straight up, and he said, absolutely. We're going to back this, and he did. And that's when I thought we had a real shot. And it gets better. Probably your next president. April of last year. Listen to what she says about education. The federal government already believes that they have your kids, not you. Listen to what she said about Common Core, and listen to what she says about education.
You know, when I think about the really unfortunate argument that's been going on around Common Core, it's very painful. How did we end up at a point where we are so negative about the most important non-family enterprise in the raising of the next generation, which is how our kids are educated?
The most important non-family issue is education. This is none of your business. It's none of your concern. Education is not your business. The single most important iteration, right, of education that is a non-family issue. She already believes this. How did she go from it takes a village to raise children? Well, I understand. It makes perfect sense. How you get from it takes a village, not a parent, to raise kids. You get to this, right? Just the federal village now will raise your kids. And isn't it interesting that it takes a village means that parents work with other family people to raise? Now it's the federal government does it for you. How a presidential candidate can so glibly say that to you that education is exclusively a non-family issue. Right? But then again, you want to vote for the Republicans after you see what they just did, right? Where do you go? It's already been done. In the short term, then, it's going to stop right here. All I endeavored to do today in an hour and a half, all I endeavored to do was to give you an arc and a narrative. By the way, you email me, I'll send you all the slides for free. Every slide was documented. Every slide, I tell you where I got it from. Take them. You don't know me. You don't know me. So you shouldn't trust me. Stop trusting people. Don't trust me. Take the slides and you fact check me. Because I've done 450 of these, nobody has yet written back to me and said that any of this information is false. Take the slides. But when you recognize that this is the truth, you can fill in the gaps. If you want to, I can spend 2 more hours talking about how data gathering works. If you want to, we can talk about those provisions in the healthcare law that force schools to become unqualified physicians and clinicians about your kids. You want to talk about those things, we can. But you now at least have an arc. You now know that Common Core is a tumor, it's not the disease. You now know how, from going back to the 1890s, going back to the 1930s, going back to the 40s and the 60s, all the way through the creation of the Federal Department of Education and into where you are now. You now understand where all these pieces fit. And the bottom line of all of this is that yes, Common Core is abhorrent. But you have nobody in this country at any high position who's looking out for your kids' education. Think about it. In 1979, we created the Department of Education. From that day forward, what's the first thing the Department of Ed did? They created tests, big national tests that they were in control of, ultimately. And from that moment on, your kids' scores vis-a-vis the other industrialized nations in the world went down, down, down. Common Core now is a great leap farther down that path. You know how it's going to turn out because you know how the previous 30 years of this kind of education turned out. You can't keep, you've heard the phrase, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. Common Core digs you down 3 more levels. The ESSA Act digs you down 5 more and then pours concrete over your head. All right? This is all federal law now. So California let's say it's not, and with all due respect to California, I know enough about your state to know that for every one of you here paying attention, there are, 75,000 who aren't paying any attention to this? We get that, right? Yes. But even if California was to have a great epiphany and recognize that their kids' educational futures were being destroyed in the name of something that has nothing to do with education, that by wrecking the abilities of everybody to become who God made them to be, we are going to be better off. Maybe you'll recognize that one day. Now, you don't just have to fight it in California. Now, California, you're going to have to fight it in Washington. Good luck with that. It's going to have to happen. But what happened with the ESSA Act is what was 4 months ago a California problem. And we've been saying this for 5 years, that if you don't fix this at the state level, very soon you will not have the fix for it. So you can't really fix California education outside of this paradigm. You must try. And the more pressure you put on politicians and educators in California, the more you could get them maybe to turn their ire to Washington. That's unfortunately, and look at who this falls to. Falls to the grassroots, right? You want to fix this, your politicians aren't going to do it. You're going to have to do it. But that means you're going to have to start electing people to school boards. When you guys have a school board election in your county, who shows up? 8% of the vote? Who votes in those things? I would argue there is no more important political office in your community than who's on your school boards. And yet, 8%, 6% of the people turn out and vote. And before we get too high and mighty about all of this, the reason education went this way is because we stopped paying attention. Because for far too many, this is why your founding, they were right about so many things. I know, they're bullies and they're thugs and they're racist, I get it. But they were right about so many things. And one of the things they were right about is that education should have always remained the primary responsibility of the parents. But for 80 years now, public schools have become glorified daycare for us. 8, 10 hours a day, we dump them off and we go and do whatever else we have to do. And until we change that mindset, somebody once famously said, the American people get the government they deserve. So we ultimately did this, we'll ultimately have to take it back. But that means your kids. And I'm going to leave you with this last thought. I have all these politicians and all this stuff, and I've talked to dozens of bishops because the Catholic schools all took this, talked to all the Lutheran pastors whose parish schools took this, talked to all these political legislatures. Politics. Getting something done politically is hard. Even if we right now, in earnest, start to pull this out, and everybody in the country joins with us, it's going to take 20 years to get rid of it if we start now. Can you wait 20 years to give your kids a good education? My only comment, my personal comment on all of this, with all the talking that I've done, is this. If you got your kids in the public schools, you're going to lose them. There is no safe place. It's a hard lesson, but there's no safe place. If you want your kids to grow up with your values, if you want your kids to become good at stuff, not full of ideology, you can't keep them there anymore. There are no safe schools. There was a poll done about a year ago. 88% of American parents agree that the public school system is broken. 88%. Only 19% think their school is broken. Do you understand the problem with that? My schools are fine. That can't be true. Right? So, figure out a way to put them in safe private schools, because 50-60% of all the private schools have gone Common Core. Figure out a way, or homeschool them. I don't know any other way. That's my 2 cents in having seen this, and I think the pastor would agree with me that from a Christian perspective, the biblical injunction is our job to raise our kids. I would argue that if you're not religious, I would argue common sense argues that. We work 2 jobs. We have moms and dads working. Every mom and dad who's ever said to me, I can't homeschool my kids. I can't homeschool my kids. We both have to work to make ends meet. And then you look around and the kids are wearing Nikes and they got iPads and they're in expensive after-school programs. Look, if you can work 2 jobs to buy your kids stuff, is that the stuff more important than what they're not learning? I mean, it's not I have yet to encounter, for some people I get the cost thing, but for most people I've encountered, it's not about money, it's about time. Who has the time? I don't have the time to teach my kids real history. I don't have the time to teach my kids real math. Okay, maybe you don't. But if you don't, you have nobody to blame why your kids become math illiterate. Right? You have nobody to blame. This is a tough, and 5 years ago, and I want to thank the faithful Christian servants who put this on. We already thanked the pastor. The people who are trying to inform you about this, I don't get paid. They'll attest to you, I don't get paid for this. These 450 talks, I haven't made a single dime on them. They pay my way out here out of their own pockets. People donate. They buy me a plane ticket. They put me up in a hotel so I don't go bankrupt. My wife wouldn't like that. I know that much math. Keep the wife happy. That's my math. Keep the wife happy. Right? So I don't lose money on these trips. But in all of these trips, it's the same thing. It's people like this. It's moms and dads who are trying to wake people up, because no one else is looking out for you. This Orange County, are we still in Orange County here? The Orange County School Board has got some disastrously bad people on it in terms of this, because we don't pay attention to what's going on in the school boards. So I'm always tempted, I just don't want to leave you with such a negative thing. I do think that if American moms and dads, especially moms, demand real education for their kids, they will get it. But here we are, look at you. 60% of you, when we started this talk, didn't know what Common Core was, and we've had it for 6 years. If even 10% of America's moms and dads, that's what's 10% of 320 million. See, this is a math problem. 3.2 million? Is that right? No, it's more than that. 32. If 32 million moms and dads, 10%, demanded real education, you'd get it tomorrow. But how do you wake them up? There's the hope. We can still turn it around, but it's going to require sacrifice, commitment, and engagement on the parts of moms and dads. Thank you very much for listening today. I appreciate it.